think it's time to start with our DAAD Climate Lecture Series today, and I'm happy to welcome you to the third session of the second round of the DAAD Climate Lecture Series, organized by the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, and also the Global Centres for Climate and Environment. My name is Petra Bogenschneider. I'm the head of the unit at DAAD Bonn, organizing this lecture series. And on behalf of the German Academic Exchange Service, I would like to welcome you all. And I'm delighted that all of us have gathered here today to listen to you, dear Lucy Waruingi, for today's lecture. Just a brief background on what we are doing today. The DAAD is funding a total of 4 Centers for Climate and Environment with support from the German Federal Foreign Office. And all of the centers deserve the title of Global Centres insofar as they are based in a minimum of 2 countries, in the Global South and in Germany. And if you would like to find out more on the program, you find also the link of the program's website in the chat today. My colleagues posted there. And before I give the floor to today's chair of the session, Professor Katja Thielberger from the Global Center for Climate and Environment, SAGE, who will also introduce our guest speaker today, I would like to provide you with a few organizational notes and also conduct a very short survey with you to get a better impression of the audience that is joining here today. First of all, on the technical details, the microphones and cameras of the participants are switched off and also will remain so for the entire lecture today. You can ask questions anytime via the chat function, and we will collect the questions and pose them to Lucy after the lecture in the Q&A part of today's session. And also for you to know, we are recording the event today and we will publish it on the DAAD channel on YouTube and also on the DAAD Global Centres website. So to start, I would like to conduct the survey with you, and we have prepared 2 short questions and kindly ask you to participate in the survey. First of all, we would like to know from which region you joined today, and you should see already the answers on the right-hand side of the video, and the possible answers, as you see, are Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Europe, North America, or Australia. And I'll give you a few moments to answer the question to see who is with us today. And we already see a lot of answers. So we have a good mix of participants today from Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Asia as well. As you can see, it's quite, the same share between the different continents, and it's good to see that we have such a good mix here today in the audience. And I already would like to go on to the second question today, and we would also like to know why you have joined the session today. And we would like to know whether you probably are part of one of the 4 climate centers, whether you are researching, studying in the field of climate and environment yourself, but probably are not part of one of the climate centers that are funded by DAAD, whether you have a particular interest in Lucy's work and the topic for today, or whether you probably are interested in DAAD events in general. You can click multiple answers in this question, and we would also be happy to know why you joined here today. So please click your answers. And we see here that a lot of you are part of one of the climate centers. That's great to know that the topic today also interests you, that you are studying and researching at the climate centers, but also people who are generally interested in the topic of the climate centers as well and working there as well too. Okay, thank you very much for that. And now I'm handing over to Katja Thielberger, who will moderate this lecture today and also present us the speaker of today. Katja, I hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter, for the introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lucy Waruingi, our today's speaker. So when I was asked by the DAAD to suggest speakers for this year's session of this high-end lecture series, Lucy was actually the top of my list. So I was really happy that she accepted fast to give this presentation. Lucy is currently the Executive Director of the African Conservation Centre, ACC, in Kenya, and she is one of the top leaders in conservation, in environmental conservation and wildlife conservation in Africa. And the list of her appointments and honors and achievements is really long, so I'll just give you a few highlights. The main reason for my suggestion to invite her for this lecture series is that she fits perfectly into this idea of the DAAD that for the climate centers, where we try to combine research results with practical application on the ground and also integrate local communities into conservation practice. And this is exactly what's Lucy's expertise, and she's actually one of the top leaders in conservation of environment and wildlife in Africa. So, and she has more than 2 decades of experience in this combination of, scientific results and using scientific results for conservation on the ground. Just a few bio-sketch information. So she holds a BSc in computer science and statistics from the University of Nairobi. And she did her master's at Manchester Metropolitan University in Geographic Information Systems, and GIS applications are also one of her main interests, GIS applications in conservation. And her PhD at the University of Toronto deals with one of her key competencies, which is the question of how to integrate indigenous local knowledge in biodiversity assessment and to enhance its value to nature and people. So how to create a win-win situation between nature conservation and the livelihood of people. So she's known for mainstreaming scientific results and biodiversity data as well as indigenous knowledge into conservation planning. For example, Lucy is a recognized leader in the application of geoinformatics, spatial integrated planning, and scientific and indigenous biodiversity knowledge to inform conservation policy, practice, and landscape management. And to that end, she has led several national and international research and conservation initiatives, including development of biodiversity informatics platforms. For example, she has initiated Kenya's first biodiversity atlas. She's engaged in international strategies, wildlife connectivity assessments, and regional research on biodiversity and infrastructure. And as such, she has also contributed to CBD reporting and conservation advocacy in Africa. Lucy was also the founding chair of the Conservation Alliance of Kenya and currently serves also as a chairperson of the Wildlife Conservation Trust Fund. She sits on many more advisory and technical boards, and the list is too long to reiterate here. So, as I said, the main reason for inviting her or suggesting the DAAD to invite her is this combination of her work, which is founded in research, but very much also goes into application and also into application of indigenous knowledge into biodiversity conservation. And this is also the topic of her talk today, which is dealing with community-based rangeland reforestation for sustainable livelihoods. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and the floor is yours, Lucy.
Thank you, Katja, for that very generous introduction. I consider myself a co-learner with everyone else who is doing great work across the globe. Also, my special thanks to DAAD for this opportunity to be part of this lecture series. I became interested and have been following on the previous lecture series that you've been hosting. Very informative, very inspiring. And my goal today, I hope, as we talk through, is that it will create a platform for us to learn from each other, but also really keen to see where we can synergize across other countries or initiatives or programs, really around biodiversity, climate change, and livelihoods. So thank you, and with your permission, I will now start. I have a presentation, and I just want you, Katja, to confirm that it is visible and clear. Can you see it? Is it okay? Okay, great. So thank you once again. As introduced, my name is Lucy Waruingi. I'm the Executive Director of the African Conservation Center. I was really honored to be invited, and I now know that I owe my thanks to Katja. Thank you very much for the nomination. And we did broaden and modify slightly the title of my presentation, and it will be looking at community-based rangeland restoration for sustainable livelihoods. And I'll walk you through the journey that ACC has been on and the extent to which we play in this nexus of research, conservation, and community, which is really foundational in how we have worked. The dryland systems of Kenya and of East Africa are some just savanna grasslands and others are dryland forests. And so the modification of the title was to ensure that we are covering both the forest, dryland landscapes and also the grassland landscapes. And I also want to give credit to my team at the African Conservation Center and our various affiliates for the work that's been done over decades, of which this will just be a sample. So just a brief introduction of the African Conservation Center. We're a Kenyan non-profit organization working in the East African savannas, but with programs and partnerships across Africa and also globally, especially when we look at comparative studies between one continent and another and between one country and another. And I'll be mentioning some of those today. Our broad vision is the conservation of large open landscapes, linking knowledge, biodiversity, and human well-being. And our purpose is anchored on fostering the integration of local, national, and global efforts to promote the conservation of ecosystems and the coexistence of people and wildlife. Because in these systems, as many of you who have worked in the savanna systems or dryland systems know, livestock is a central part of that space. And the pastoral community are an integral component for building resilient landscapes. And so we ensure that our work isn't in any manner separate, but brings those elements together. So broadly, as I said, our mission is to conserve large open landscapes. And how we do this is around 4 pillars of work. One is around science and research, which is a big anchor of how we work and where we work, ensuring that we have evidence to support the work that we're doing on the ground. Our second big pillar is on community conservation initiatives, by working with communities on the ground and ensuring that every action, be it research, be it interventions for implementation of conservation action, that communities are central to that. And then a third important pillar that has grown, especially in the last 10 years, is the influencing of policy and practice. And we've done a lot of work in working with local authorities at the county level and national at the national level, and also interfacing with a few global movements to see how what we are learning on the ground and what we are promoting as best practice is also making its way into policy and legal frameworks. And finally, and not least, which is where part of my presentation falls, we have been developing a growing conservation and knowledge hub, a hub where we bring together what we know, we bring other actors who share what they're doing and what they know, and together co-create solutions for the future. So this conservation knowledge hub is both a physical space at our offices in Karen, but it is also a distributed space in the landscapes that we work. So just to give you a synopsis of Kenya and where that sits in relation to some of the climate pressures that are expected or are studied. Kenya is very fortunate. If you look at the equator, we sit right in the middle of the equator. And if you look across the globe, countries that are bounded by the equator, north and south, have some of the richest biodiversity found nowhere else in the world. And in Kenya, over 6,500 plant species, 260 of which are endemic, over 1,000 bird species, over 150 mammals. And you would see that same pattern across the northern part of South America. You also see that across in the Asian areas north of the equator. That whole belt is very rich, both in diversity, but also in its altitudinal gradient, providing therefore a variety of climates that allow for this variation of biodiversity. A very rich continent. When you look to the image on the other side on the right, it's just mapping out our mammal density distribution for large mammals. And you will see the species richness is very dense along the East African Rift Valley and across the Albertine Rift in Uganda and Rwanda, and down through the Tanzanian country, again, because of the great altitudinal gradient that is found in that area, crossed over also with the equator. So we're sitting on a rich natural heritage. Studies that we did with some other people in 2011 in mapping all the vertebrates showed again this unique distribution across the East African Rift Valley, down the southeastern part of Tanzania, and again in the Albertine Rift west of the East African area. There's high solar radiation and energy availability. There's wide habitat heterogeneity. There's a great specialization of various niche species and complex population interactions, which increase as you move towards the equator. But then we want to look at the history of conservation in Africa, and more so in East Africa. Over the past century and a half, going on to 150 years, conservation has been pursued largely by Western interests that wanted to really ensure that this great heritage that they were finding as they explored Africa was still maintained and sustained. And so through a lot of variety of initiatives, national parks were created and forest reserves were created and other forms of protected areas, which at that point were seen as areas to ensure that these important biodiversity areas are protected. But through this, there was a dominant paradigm, which we in recent years are calling fortress conservation, because these places excluded local people because it was seen as a way of providing maximum protection. And therefore, the presence of indigenous people and local communities was seen as incompatible with conservation. And you have seen in recent years, especially from around 2015, there's a rethinking of this conservation model to ensure that the rights of indigenous people are right at the center of all conservation initiatives. And so if you look at a pathway of how conservation has evolved, in ACC, we like describing this as the conservation movement description, where initially around the time when there was partitioning of Africa, there was also the segregation of parks and reserves and forests, as I said, that were initially demarcated by the colonial governments, but later established under national governments as state-owned resources. With international support over the years, conservation investments were made into these state-protected areas. But beginning in the mid-80s and late 80s actually, going into the early 90s, and ACC was a big pioneer of this movement, community-based conservation began to be recognized as an area that could not be ignored. And this was because if you take the example of Kenya, we have data going back to 1977, 70% of our wildlife resource and our critical biodiversity areas is found outside the protected areas. So you begin to realize that one reason we are losing biodiversity and losing in our conservation agenda is because the very areas that are excluded outside parks, outside reserves, outside forest preserves are actually the areas with highest biodiversity, but these are the areas where communities and local people live. So the movement of community-based conservation involving communities began. And I'll be showing you examples of how that has grown as a big movement in Kenya and indeed in most of Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa. Now, in recent years, we have moved to what we are calling community-led conservation. So that communities are not only involved, where there is funding available to an NGO to support them to undertake a conservation activities, but communities are at the center of that conservation work. And the examples I'll be sharing here today is how the African Conservation Center has, over the last decades, increased its ability and its commitment and its investment in ensuring communities are at the center. If we're to ensure we have resilient landscapes that can respond to the changing climate, and we also have communities that are able to develop a livelihood out of those initiatives. So in all these areas, and this really underscores the reason we do what we do, is that there is unsustainable land use practices, there's weakened community land governance as laws on how land is used are changed, and some of those laws are passed on without the involvement of communities in determining what will work best on their land. And then, as we all know, there's growing pressure on natural resources from development, from settlements, from investment opportunities like mining, roads, rails, power lines. And all these create great pressure in these spaces that are also the most vulnerable to the changing climate. So at ACC for the last 25 years, we've really served as an East African hub that advances that collaborative conservation so that we can sustain biodiversity, culture, and community. And so our story begins with that. When in 1990, having worked from the 70s to 90s, a lot on evidence building and building an understanding of what's driving conservation, what sustains it, what's the people component on it, we realized that communities had to be central. And in the very first years actually 1990 and 1995, we established some of the first community-based initiatives out in Laikipia and one other in Magadi, in areas that did not have parks and were not protected by government, but had a rich wildlife base and had a rich community culture that promoted conservation. And so those were the beginnings of that, of the initiatives of community-based conservation. And then we have grown that to not just have community-based conservation initiatives that are supported, and with grants that we got from USAID, with grants from the European Union, with grants from various foundations and groups in the European Union. They supported these community initiatives on the ground, which included establishing ecotourism sites and looking at other nature-based enterprises. We also realized that if all you do is invest on the ground on the activities without investing in the people and their institutions, then you are not building sustainability. So we then have had almost 2 decades of growing local institutions. So not just involving them in community-based conservation, but establishing and growing local institutions so that they themselves can be responsible and the custodians of the actions on the ground and solicit the support they need directly without necessarily needing to go through a middle institution. And we have found over time, and I'll give you 3 examples, that has enabled the landscape to have more resilient actions on the ground that are driven by communities, then with support from institutions, NGOs, both local and international. So our model for people at the center involves shifting power and influence, that power moves from the donor, power moves from the NGO, and power moves to the people to define their future. It involves ensuring there's transparency in the actions that are taken on the ground. It involves acknowledging and including indigenous knowledge. Sometimes our scientific papers are very well studied, very well researched, very well documented, but do not involve the knowledge that's coming from the community. It involves defining new partnerships and funding models that can fund at the point of impact, not just fund at the sort of administrative level, but fund the groups at the point where their work happens and makes a difference. And finally, our model includes long-term investments in people through trust and equity. And so, looking at a glance, as we look at this topic for today, how have we involved communities in looking at restoration initiatives in these landscapes that are community-led and that improve their resilience to climate change? So one is our conservation science and applied research. We have moved to an era of co-designing our research with communities. So it's not research that's delivered to them, but it's research that's co-designed with them and implemented with them, and the results shared back with them. We've also involved them in biodiversity assessments so that they are key and central in the planning and the decision making. We've also supported community-led initiatives in conservation, in research, and in restoration. And of importance to today's discussion is the community-led restoration initiatives that are building resilience and adaptive capacity of the local communities. And coupled with that is partnerships for enterprise opportunities, and then supporting these initiatives not only at a grassroots level, but also scaling up nationally and globally. And so in the time we have, I'll be giving you a snippet of each of these so that you can see where perhaps we might learn from each other and grow together. So one of the more recent pieces of work we've done is adopt the Rome methodology. If you are all familiar with the Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative globally, that's become recognized as a means not only for restoring ecological integrity at scale, but also generating additional benefits locally and globally. And the Rome methodology, developed by the IUCN, which stands for Restoration Opportunities Assessment Methodology, Rome, has a very participatory, flexible framework to rapidly identify areas that are degraded and then locate special areas of opportunities for restoration. This is an ongoing project we are implementing under the GEF7 Global Environmental Facility. Our implementing agency is our NEMA, National Environmental Management Authority, and ACC is one of the lead NGOs in the sub-executing agencies, together with other local groups and government agencies. And in the southern rangelands of Kenya, where we work, a pilot site has been identified that covers 7,000 kilometers, straddles between Western Kajiado and Eastern Narok. Its rainfall ranges between, in the very, very low dry season would be lower dry season would be as low as 250 millimeters, but can grow up to 62 millimeters annually. And that's been the average. We do have severe drought that's been recorded in 65, in 84, in 2000, and 2009 was actually the worst ever recorded drought. And I'll share with you the work that we did to help bring community data to the local government attention and to national attention in enabling communities to respond effectively to extreme droughts. So this area reflects about almost 170,000 area degraded, but the target area for restoration, which is 4% of the area, is 62,000 hectares. That at the end of the grant, in another 2 years, these are the areas targeted for restoration. So the process has involved a lot of community restorations, whether in meetings centers that are near communities, or under the tree, or out in the field, or with the county offices, being able to discuss with them what do they see and how do they see the trends of degradation in their area, and then sending them out to actually use basic tools that run off a cell phone to record the location of the areas that are degraded, to rank that degradation, and then to also identify any interventions that are going on the ground or that are possible. So out of this process, participatory process of engaging communities, we've been able to map 3 categories: areas that are stable, defining the state of degradation from 2003 to about 2022. It's almost a decadal assessment, both using satellite data and then ground truthing with this participatory process with communities. And you identify there that we have 11% of the area was indicated as stable, 87% needing improvement, and 1% under degraded status. and that was using state as the indicator. Then we look at the trajectory of degradation, and now you're looking at what is the projected, based on the current rate of degradation, what's the projected trajectory of degradation? And the indicator there is quite alarming, as you would expect. The stable is only 70%, the areas of improvement is 27%, but the area under degradation rises by 2%. And so we then identify which areas can we target for restoration out of that. And within the stable area, the stable area can increase to 97%. If we improve the entire targeted area, that's why you have a zero improvement scale, and target to restore 2% of the degraded area that had been previously identified. And if you see on the map, the dark purple areas are most of the highly degraded areas that were both identified by satellite imagery, but also in the participatory process, ground truth by communities, going to the villages where they work, giving a GPS location and identifying with a photograph the state of degradation and the interventions that are possible or required. And the following interventions were identified through this process. In some areas, farmer-managed natural regeneration is going to be the priority. In other areas, seedling production for species-appropriate seedlings in the areas that can regrow in these areas, either dry land, that area both has a dryland forest and also has grasslands. It was identified the need for training. Sometimes there are tree growing initiatives that plant the wrong tree at the wrong time in the wrong place. And so it means the effectiveness of those trees surviving is very low. So there's going to be need for training on all those aspects of natural regeneration and restoration. And also using other tools like the half moons in some areas where there is high soil erosion, and the half moons help keep the soil from running off and restore some vegetation around where the moon exists. Construction of gabions where appropriate, and then expansion of grass banking initiatives. And I'll talk a bit about that because that's been a great project that has also improved livelihoods from an economic perspective for communities. And finally, the ever evasive issue of invasive species. Managing the continued growth of invasive species continues to be a challenge. We have areas that have been mapped in terms of the invasive species spread, but finding effective interventions that would prevent it from regrowing is still underway. Some have biological control experiments, others are doing manual harvesting, and others are finding alternative nature-based solutions for the invasive weed management. And if there are people in this group who have some effective opportunities around that, we would really be happy to partner and discuss that further. I will not go into details, but this is some of the tables we produce for every region after the communities have mapped the degradation status. We identify the site in exact ward administratively where it occurs, the site, the nature of the degradation, and the restoration opportunities on each of those, and the hectares that can be restored. So we've done this for the entire landscape, and our next steps now are to look at the priorities for implementing the restoration activities in each of these. So this report is available, though it's a work in progress, but these are some of the tables that we are generating for that work. And then I want to move on to what we are calling community-led research, where communities themselves collect the data for the areas in terms of collect the monitoring data for the areas that are restored and areas that are not restored to provide a control data set that helps you identify what's the status of the grassland. This data is collected month on month. In some of these plots, so the plots that you're looking at, to give you some context, around here where you see the light gray, that's the Amboseli dry season lake bed. The red spots, the red mappings are the permanent plots that have been studied for over 40 years every month by communities who take a measurement of the grass condition. And I'll show you some of the graphs that are produced. And then the black round plots are the random plots that are collected. And then the areas with a sort of a highlight with a star are the drought points, the points that have been studied in the points at the points of extreme drought. And these are local young men from the community who are given what would be sophisticated tools if you were sending a master's students, but have been simplified into tools that can work on an app on the phone, because cell phones are now ubiquitous in the entire landscape, on an app using Color Toolbox. So they locate the point, they write on the app the state of the grasses, the state of the soil, the species of grass they can see, the state of grazing pressure from wildlife and from livestock. And this data is sent directly to our servers online. So the data is all collected by the local community. We train them to collect it. They collect it on their cell phone. The data comes back on an online portal. And within a day, the results of that data are produced. And we've been able to go back to the community and share with them the results of that data. So we currently have 64 plots that are monitored monthly. And some of them are in women-owned grass banks where we are using, as I said, some are control points where there's no restoration, others are where there's restoration, so that we can see the effects of the restoration. And we have grass banks, which I'll show you, managed by women, where they're regenerating the grass and then managing to also use that both for their livestock and for selling economically. So coming out of this, one of the things ACC now is doing is to expand this at scale. We've piloted this work for over 40 years in the Amboseli landscape, and now in the entire Southern Rangelands under the Southern Rangelands Coalition, which we lead, we'll be undertaking this monitoring in Narok, in landscapes in Narok, broader Kajiado, and in Taita Taveta. So the entire cross-border area of Southern Kenya is captured with baseline monitoring, with biodiversity assessments that look at ecosystem health, with horizontal learnings across the different groups. And more recently, in fact, as recent as next week, we'll be going across the border to also share and collect data cross-border in northern Tanzania. So the groups on southern Kenya can also learn from the groups in northern Tanzania. And we are now embedding into this a One Health program, where we also look at the health of the people, the livestock and the animals and the land, and ensure then that the investments are promoting a One Health system, where you're not only looking at conservation or looking at wildlife, but you're looking at people and their animals, because then you have the integrity of the system as you develop nature-based enterprises. So this is the entire landscape under which we are scaling up the monitoring to be beyond this Amboseli sector, to go across on these areas and in all the identified degraded areas. These again are the plots that have been studied, in the permanent plots over 40 years, and the emerging plots have been coming on over the last few decades. And this monitoring framework is replicable, so we are happy to share it with others, and we can train others who can also then implement it in their rangelands and benefit from the tools that we have put together. So on the ground, we are partnering with women grassroots institutions who are establishing the grass banks, and then we are also partnering with the local grazing committees, because the grazing committees determine where the local herders go, and where they go should be informed by where the grass is most suitable, so that you reduce grazing in the heavily grazed areas or in the areas that have been hit by extreme drought, and you rotate your grazing to the areas that have been restored. So here is an example of a restored plot on your left, and that's one of our senior community resource assessors. This is Amboseli. You can see the elephants in the background. And so they're using a pin frame to measure the grass height, the level of the types of species, and the grazing pressure. This is an area that's been restored. On your right is an area that's not been restored. And you can see the difference. It's like night and day. That monitoring using the local community helps us see what happens if you restore using community-based approaches, what happens when you don't restore, and you then have the evidence of the data that you can use to inform then the opportunities and the support needed to restore a space so that it's both suitable for livestock, for wildlife, and for people. Again, these are some of the resource assessors. We call them community resource assessors, again with a pin frame in a different experimental plot. So we move from different type of habitats so that we have a good variety of assessments that are done. And then we use the knowledge there to determine where to establish green grass banks for the women to manage. And here are some of the results, which I'm going to go over very quickly, that we are able to generate online from already written R scripts that then take the data and produce the results. Inside a restored area and outside where it's not restored, the blue line is the vertical line is your biomass, grams per meter squared. You can see inside restored area, your biomass is higher. Outside in an area that's not restored, your biomass is really low and rarely has a very small peak in May when there's rainfall, but that's because it's being heavily grazed throughout. Look at the ground cover inside slightly higher, the ground cover outside lower than that. The big deal is in the grazing pressure. When the grazing pressure is not controlled, then you have a plummeting of your biomass. This is the grazing pressure inside. It is slightly higher in the rainy season because the area has been preserved for restoration, but in areas that are open and not under restoration, then the grazing pressure is higher. So we call these results grass to graph, because as soon as they measure the grass, within the same day, you have graphs of the results. And then we're working with these women. These women work in the local homesteads, local settlements around where our experimental plots are. And these women are in charge of the restoration. We look at a degraded area like the one here marked J1. It's overgrazed. We established a traditional olopololi. An olopololi is a Maasai word for restoration, where they would naturally do this in the past. They would go to an area, keep their cattle there, graze in one area, and then grow another area meanwhile. And so these olopololis became a natural space for the rotational grazing. So we are reintroducing these olopololis and grass seed banks. We put low fences that would not kill the wildlife if they crossed over, but it prevents livestock and the small grazers from eating. And the women are then able to harvest. This is the same plot after restoration. The women were able to grow grass over the boma seed. They were able to collect the hay and sell it. And also there's a great demand for the restored seeds. And in 1 year, they are making at least 1.2 million Kenya shillings. That's about $10,000 just from the grass that they are able to sell that has been restored. So the potential is also useful from a livelihood perspective. So the economic opportunities are here. In the olopololis, it increases the resilience, as you would expect, because the areas then serve as a buffer against the intensity of droughts and climate change. It supports the women because they're able to sell their hay and improve their economic livelihoods, but also improve their adaptive capacity. It supports the value of the value chain around milk. So in these areas, the women have calves. So in Maasai culture, the land belongs to the men, the cattle belongs to the men, but the milk belongs to the women. And so we've worked with the women to enable them to have outlets to sell their milk in a retail outlet. And when there's a glut, we have purchased a 5,000 liter milk coolant so that they can then store their milk in bulk and sell to the end buyer and avoid the middlemen. So it's also improved their ability to really have better economic gain from that. We're engaging the youth in monitoring the health of the rangelands. And then we are using this knowledge to serve as an early warning for droughts, to know where should they restore, what is the projected outlook of the droughts, and then informing the grazing management of the grazing committees. And so in about 5 minutes, I'd like to walk you through some of the results of what we are now calling a One Health ecosystem monitoring, because beyond what we had done historically, beginning last year, we've added the One Health program, One Health framework. So where we are monitoring both the health of the land, the health of the animals, the diseases the animals have, the health of the wildlife, and the health of the people. So some of the barometer, so we produce the results in using graphic interface because that's easier for people to understand instead of graphs. So what you're seeing on your left, for example, on green shows the grass biomass was in good condition. Amber is that it was getting into the red, and red means that you have a high drought. So if you look at April and May, 2 consecutive months, you can see the barometer is going more and more into red because we were approaching a drought. And this helps in predicting what ought to happen on the ground when you see the barometer change. And these were based on rainfall patterns and grazing pressure in the southern Kajiado. So in 2009, I said I would give you a feedback on how we were able to monitor the droughts in 2009 using these pressure gauges, or what we call the pressure gauge index. On my extreme left is January 2009, and below that is January 2022, 3 years later. Look at the extreme drought. The marker was on the middle of red. 4 years later, the marker was on green, as it normally would be. But you can see in 2009, everything was in the red. In January, in April, in June, in August, and in October. But in 2022, you can see it's green in January, a bit amber in June, and it only goes red in August and October. So in that year, 2009 was the highest extreme drought that had been seen in a long time. And we were able to share these results that are based on looking at the satellite imagery, looking at the ground truthing data. It's coupled with aerial counts, because we do monthly aerial counts of wildlife through a program by Dr. David Weston, and use this both to look at ground data, aerial survey, and satellite data to inform what's going on the ground. These are the same community members monitoring the drought. And in the core design framework, this knowledge, whereas you have the typical researchers collecting, we now have communities being part of the collection of the data and the feedback and dissemination, and that feeds back into improving the design. And last month, we were able to sit with communities to share with them the long-term results of the data from 1980, in this case, up to 2025, on the grasses, on the herbs, and on the trees. And you can see the grass biomass is decreasing. The trees have started making a recovery. The herbs have made a slight recovery and are on the decline again. But the shrubs have had a heavy decline. And then on the right is the aerial counts of wildlife, the darker green and agriculture. The darker green is showing where people have been increasing in farming. And so you can see over time, the increase in farming is also contributing to the loss of water and loss of habitat in some of these areas, coupled with the increase in settlements. And then we recorded a video, which I will not play now, but it will be available, of this gentleman. I can play it briefly. I don't know if you can hear the audio. If you cannot, you can at least see the words, but he's talking about what he has seen over the last 50 years on the drought and the land and the habitat and how it has affected them. And then we couple that with our research over 50 years to show the points of convergence in both of those. So really making sure communities are part of the feedback and part of the dissemination and part of the information generation of what we should do in these areas. I'll stop the video, but we have it available with subtitles so you can hear what he is saying. And so we've been expanding the sites. So now the sites have expanded beyond this area. And as I said, we are keen to expand them also to other areas beyond to Narok and to Taita Taveta. These are some of the other results that show pasture level is poor, average pasture level and good pasture level in relation to rainfall. And if there's one message I can say here, it's a bit of a busy slide, but the one message that we have found from this work is that even with the same level of rainfall, the black jagged line is rainfall up here. Even with the same level of rainfall, we are losing pasture condition because of the intensity of grazing. So it's critical that we invest in developing grazing frameworks with community that allow for regeneration, that allow for restoration, and that allow for better milk yields. And you can see the milk yields fluctuates equally, and the body condition reduces also when the milk yield reduces, as you would expect, which then also affects the offtake of the crop. We also have community perspectives on the livestock losses during the other drought of 2022, and we record those as we interview the communities. And then one other component we've added from last year is understanding what information do they need, so that we're not only collecting data that we think we need as scientists, but we're also collecting data on what they need. Most importantly, they need information on drought alerts. That's critical for them. They need information on livestock diseases. They need information on hay stock production and predation of their livestock from others. So that also should inform community-led research in where research should be. These are some of the indicators we are collecting in the cross-border One Health program, looking at different health indicators in the northern Tanzania and southern Kenya. And then through the Amboseli Conservation Program, and Victor has been leading this work, provided an interactive dissemination dashboard where the results and responses from community are also available on an interface that people can look at, and you can click on it and see what did they say they needed in this area. Was it water quality that's an issue? Is it stressors of lack of water? Is it diseases of livestock? And we're able to use that interactive framework to also see where the information needs would be most useful. And so for ACC, as I come to a close, we're trying to bridge this gap, not only community-led information generation and sharing, but also to inform policy and innovative funding frameworks. So one way we're doing this is to build community institutions. And in the last couple of years, we have supported local grassroots groups to become legitimately registered institutions that then can manage and run conservation programs by themselves, get into funding with other partners, and be well established. So in 2008, we supported the establishment of the South Rift Association of Landowners, Soralo, and they're now a growing group with over 2,000, several thousand staff, or hundreds of staff, maybe not thousands yet, hired, and they have their own funding to really scale up the work that we began with them and do even more. Twalata Nebo is a women group we've been supporting in Laikipia, which we helped establish in 2012, and they've been now established as a grassroots institution and running with their own governance framework and programs that they run with other partners. And in 2008, established the Amboseli Ecosystem Trust that then put together the first ecosystem plan that was ever gazetted in Kenya. And they now run as an independent grassroots institution, coordinating all the actors in the landscape. So this is to say, investing in the institutions also helps them improve in their adaptive capacity in the wake of climate change and the wake of land subdivision, because land subdivision and land sales in this area, this is a map of the ecosystem in Amboseli that's been subdivided since 2019. That has also exacerbated degradation, because then you have small pieces of land owned by different people who have different land use interests. And so we are working with them and other partners to try and create common areas that would be managed collectively, even in a subdivided landscape. And by doing that, would like to have clear ecosystem, delineated ecosystems that would have clear governance arrangements, whether they are privately owned, publicly owned, or government run, that they would have governance frameworks and land use policies at the national level that promote conservation and community livelihoods. And so this is a map with an effort that's now going on at a national level to ensure that these areas, like the ones I've showed you that are being subdivided, would still have a common core framework for management that ensures community livelihoods are secured in these rangelands, even as land changes and is subdivided. I will skip over some of these others in the interest of time so that we have time for questions. But this map shows some of the important corridors that are important in these ecosystems. These corridors serve both as corridors for livestock movement and also for wildlife movement. And so having policies that will secure these livestock routes and livestock grazing routes and wildlife migratory routes will be key. So looking ahead, we want to scale up co-designed research and also use other interactive platforms across the southern rangelands. We'd like to embed and have begun embedding community research products so that research data and data products are mainstreamed with communities and there's visibility, and even products like research tourism then becomes an opportunity where you do research with community and you can have people coming in to support those communities in their research. supporting continuous horizontal learning in these savanna landscapes, and looking for partnerships. We recognize that in areas like the EU, they are keen to support more allocation to African institutions for community-led research. So this kind of work is going to gain more and more traction as we go ahead. And finally, my last two slides, at how are we influencing policy? Out of the 2009 drought alert that was shared, that I shared with you, was then shared with the governor, and the person you're looking at there is the Kajiado County governor, and he declared a drought emergency, having seen what the data was predicting and what the data was showing on the intensity of drought from the monitoring data collected every month. And out of this, people were able to come together in a more strategic way to define what they need to do to support school feeding, feeding in schools, or providing investments into cattle that was going to die, or looking for cattle off stick before they die, or creating ways of a drought emergency response. So we can see that this kind of information can also influence county government. And then at the national level, when we shared about the risk of losing these rangelands that are getting subdivided, that have drought exacerbated, the head of our president puts the head of public service, who works under the president of the government of Kenya, in August of last year, presided over the development of an integrated ecosystem-based natural resource conservation policy. And his quote, which we love very much, says that by embracing collaboration, science-driven solutions, and a community-centric approach, we shall pave a way for resilient ecosystems and empowered communities. And I'd like to stop there because I think this creates our marching orders to really empower communities, have a community-centric approach, and work with every level of agency, grassroots, county, and national, to really promote conservation evidence-based that then enables us to secure areas, make them more climate resilient, and we can only do so if we have communities at the center. So our call to action is to collaborate, to innovate, and to work boldly in addressing these challenges, to protect these critical areas, and we have a shared responsibility as policymakers, as scientists, and to invest in this transdisciplinary research and nature-based solutions that will build landscape solutions. So thank you. I think I'll stop there. If there are other questions, and if there's time, I can come back to my last slide, but I'll just stop there with a picture of this is the landscapes we are supporting. And there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot that can be scaled up as we embed working with communities in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for this really inspiring talk about how to engage local communities in nature conservation and to their own benefit. So there's we have about 15 minutes for questions, and there's a few questions already in the chat, and I encourage the other people also to pose their question in the chat. So I'll just start right away. Maram had a question whether the data was actually collected by the community, but I believe that this question was answered in the course of the presentation. And Maram, if you still have a question, please add it in the chat. Now, there were two questions that were kind of similar by Evie and Naomi, is about how do you encourage the local community to participate? So what are the benefits? And related to that question, Naomi, who apparently has some experience with such transdisciplinary studies in citizen science, how do you keep these people motivated to stay on board?
Thank you, Naomi, for this. So let me say two approaches to keep local communities engaged. One is when we began, have been paying for what the community resource assessors that I mentioned. But what we found is that because when researchers come and they go to the field to collect data, they have facilitation to be able to do so. Either they have a car or they have a research grant. So I think in the spirit of equity and transparency and fairness, we also, for those collecting data, we need to be able to facilitate them, just like we would any scientist. But what is obvious is that it's much cheaper also because they're not needing to drive a car from the city. They live in that community. In some cases, we provide the overall person with a motorbike so that he's able to visit all the others. We provide them with the tools for the research. So when they earn a local stipend to be able to do the research month on month, that already you're creating employment for that one community resource assessor. But number two, they become the ambassadors because they go back to their communities and say, this is what I've been collecting for the last 1 year, over 12 months. And they collect this data maybe over 5 days a month. It's not every day. You just need to get, as long as, monitoring is doing the same data collection the same way in the same place. So we have a very clear regiment of how they're doing this. They become the ambassadors. They go to the ground. I didn't show you this slide where they measure the milk yield in the places where they're collecting data. They also measure the milk yield from the people who have cattle there. So they're able to relate that, oh, you have more milk today, and see, we are also showing that your pasture is in better condition. Oh, you came back with very poor milk yield, but look, we've seen the area you're grazing. Look at the data, the grazing pressure, the soil condition is very poor. So you're able to also relate the data with their livelihood and how they see the landscape. So those are one way to do it. But a third important one is officially giving feedback to them. Many times as researchers, we're accused of collecting data, using communities to collect the data, but they're never involved in what we publish, what we are writing, what we are finding. So being able to see you go back to them and share the information, and also including them as some of your co-authors, really helps them see that they are valued. But the fourth one is that some of these, as you can see, we then ended up with restoration initiatives that supported women who harvested the grass, sold the grass seed, and they still continue to do that today, year on year. And now they use the seed they've harvested to replant. So we no longer provide them with the seed harvest, the seeds to plant. They use their own seeds coming from the previous harvest. So I think those three ways can ensure that you're remaining connected with community in not in a tokenism way, but in a legitimate way, and that they really become part and parcel of what you co-design, but also part and parcel of what you disseminate to them and share with them.
Thanks. So it's really about following the classical transdisciplinary approach of co-designing, but also co-disseminating the results. There was another question about data quality. That's always an issue in citizen science. How do you ensure data quality, and how do you actually test for it? How do you know how good the data are?
Okay, thank you. Yes, that's correct. So one is training. All these community resource assessors I mentioned have been trained for many years, and we always do a refresher every year. So we train so that we make sure the method that they're using is consistent. Secondly, when you're collecting your data, because the data they're sending us includes a location, we're able to verify if the data is sitting in the right location from a coordinate perspective. But from a data content perspective, our key analysts who then sit in Nairobi can tell if your data is inconsistent. Like if month on month you had very low grass condition, and then on 1 month you have a high grass condition and there's been no rain. So we also check for outliers. We don't just necessarily publish as it comes. We have parameters, and you can embed that in your R scripts that make sure if the GIS coordinate is outside of this point, he's outside of range. If the grass condition is above this value, it's outside of range, or below this value. So there's some of those parameters. And then, of course, we have the lead community resource assessor being able to review them each month and just confirm that they're still using the same method. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question was about the type of benefits. So you mentioned milk production and other direct benefits to the communities, but how can they also benefit from more, let's say, higher level benefits such as carbon credits? So carbon sequestration could be an issue, though I personally don't believe in planting trees for carbon sequestration, but never mind. So how do they benefit from these type of credits as well? And if so, how do they do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. I think one of the things with carbon, and it may have been a misstep when many of the initial carbon projects came up, is that people were almost told, oh, you plant trees, you'll make money from carbon. But what we believe in ACC is we need to restore the land. Carbon is a byproduct, an important one, but our motivation and the reason for investing in an area should be restoration, because once you restore an area, there are various multiple benefits. Carbon being one of them, biodiversity credits being another, but it's the work that carbon does that matters, that you have a better soil condition, that you have less degraded areas that your livestock can live off, that your wildlife can benefit from, that you have other nature-based enterprises, be it beekeeping or aloe farming or gum and raisins. So I would like to see carbon as a bundle of benefits. So yes, it is a potential benefit, but we need to be careful how we sell it, if I may use that word, because in some instances, people think carbon is, I'll do nothing, I'll just plant trees, and then you're planting a monoculture that does not increase or add value to diversity. So we would rather say, how do you restore a landscape in all its elements of biodiversity? And in doing so, you will then amplify the possibility of these other multiple benefits. I know in the developing world, we are being, in a sense, expected to help pay back carbon credits for what's been polluted in the West, whereas ideally, everyone should take responsibility for the actions that they take. And we, as the people in the last frontier, with the most biodiverse areas still left intact, to ensure that our restoration improves biodiversity value, and that value should accrue to the local people and to the country. And that those biodiversity values can have many values. There's cultural value, there's ecotourism, there's nature-based enterprises, and yes, there's also then carbon and biodiversity. But I would say that we need to do that from a very well-informed perspective, so that communities in doing so are not seeing carbon as a one-off. You're really trying to say, how can we bundle many benefits that support the values of nature that nature gives to us?
I encourage you still to post some questions in the chat, but I also have a question. You mentioned in the very end what I would call something like higher level stakeholders, right? You're working a lot with local communities, but maybe not so much with governmental agencies or higher level, but you proved me wrong in your last slide. How do you balance potential conflicts of interests? And I'll just pose a very extreme potential conflict of interest is between mining in an area and preserving biodiversity. I mean, that's really extreme, but obviously the interests of the local communities might actually differ from the interests of, say, governmental agencies. So how do you balance these challenges?
Yes, that's a very good question. And actually, mining is not an extreme. Mining is right there with us. One of the slides that I removed is where we were showing areas of high biodiversity and areas that have been earmarked for mining. And the overlap is frightening, because a lot of the areas that they want to prospect for mining is actually an important conservation area. So just last
I'm afraid you're frozen.
Yeah, it seems we somehow lost the connection to Lucy. Probably the internet is not working and at some point. We probably just wait a minute whether she can rejoin.
Henry says he's reaching out to her.
Wonderful, thank you.
There she
Hello,
is.
can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know where I dropped off, but I think I was saying mining definitely is a big problem. And just last week, we visited an area that has high potential for conservation, but they already had mining going on for the last 20 years before they formed a conservancy. And one of the things they're doing as a family that has now land that has both wildlife and a mining site is to insist on only underground mining, no more exploring on the land, but going, he said something like 100 meters down and drilling below and nothing higher. So one of the things we need to explore is, are there possibilities where mining is compatible with conservation, but what type of mining would that be? It's a real challenge, even in Kenya. And so for us, what we see our role as an NGO is to advise government where there is conflict with some of their proposed actions with conservation. And so one of my interests is to say, can we really ensure we value all the different values of biodiversity, including those that relate to people and their livelihoods and their culture and their economy, because then we can amplify the value of a space. So a space isn't just seen as empty space for mining. It's a no, it's not empty. Here is what it has in terms of reptiles and birds and amphibians and plants and soil capacity, so that then you're actually saying we have many other opportunities we can explore that potentially have greater value to people even than mining. So I think it's got to be a big discussion, and that's where data comes in. Being able to really document and package the different values of nature, not from a commodification, but so that we can show that the one value is never, you can't use a one value matrix. You actually need to look at the combined value of a heterogeneous system and then say, really, should we do mining or should we maintain this system that also has multiple values for people? So it's a tricky topic, but that's where we see our role. And one of the maps we're working on is really just trying to show that complexity and that conflict with mining in some of these important conservation areas.
Thanks. No more questions in the chat. I still have questions. A question maybe about collaboration of your general program with other countries. You have this collaboration with Tanzania, as I saw in your presentation. But for example, a colleague of mine is working with the San community in Namibia, where they have the same problem, you know, first kicking them out and then realizing that they actually need them for managing the land. So do you cooperate like beyond the narrow range of Kenya and Tanzania? Do you have something like a network where you actually train the trainers for programs like this in other countries?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yes, Tanzania, of course, because it's very easy to do. But one of the things we're now doing through the African Conservation Center Knowledge Hub, Conservation and Knowledge Hub, is to bring best practice to actors in Africa so that we can both organize for horizontal learning, but also organize for capacity development. So we'd be very happy to partner, to share the tools we have, but also to where we can co-design learning exchanges. Because you do find when people learn with each other, there's a bit of confidence that grows in what others can do based on what others have seen, and vice versa. So would be very happy to do that.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I think there would have been, of course, other interesting questions, but like the question on international cooperation was also very interesting. Coming back also to the character of the Global Centres program, also working internationally together with different kind of stakeholders, researchers, etc. So thank you very much again, Lucy, for this interesting lecture today, and also thank you to Katja for moderating the session. And before we close this session, we also would like to take a quick look at the upcoming program of the lecture series. We have one more session this year with a lecturer from Latin America. It's Professor Germán Poveda from the Department of Geosciences and Environment at the National University of Colombia. And he will speak in the series on Tuesday, the 4th of November, on the impacts of climate change, deforestation and fires on the hydroclimate and water resources of the Amazon. And we would be very delighted to welcome all of you again to this session, and thank all of you for participating today again. We hope you enjoyed the lecture. I did so very much, and also thank you for the questions in the chat today, and hope to see you soon. Thanks to all of you, and goodbye. Have a nice day and a nice week.
Goodbye.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you again. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.